As has been mentioned, my name's Brian. I'd like to thank, first of all, the Boston Aquarium Society for inviting me to do this. Jackie especially, who made contact. She's super cool. A little bit, a very brief background on myself. I was an intern here at the New England Aquarium maybe, what was it, like 15 years ago? 14? Something to that effect. In the in-between time, I've been a laboratory technician at Harvard Medical School working with a colony of Asienics, which are the blind cave tetras, but that's not what I'm here to talk about tonight. Tonight I'd like to talk about Parosphromenus, which are in the hobby known as licorice gouramis. It's a group of labyrinth fish. There's 23 described species currently, and they're all from Southeast Asia, anywhere from in the north, the very southern tip of Thailand, all the way down through Borneo and Sumatra. So we can slide. These are the 23 species. One thing that we'll see as we go through the description of each of the species is these are all males. The females are the similar body shape, but they tend to have less interesting finnage and not quite as bright colors. So we can go to the next one. As I mentioned before, they're labyrinth fish. Unlike betas, they don't tend to breathe at the surface. They do have a labyrinth organ, but they tend to use that organ mostly for building their bubble nests. Slide. All right, so again, their range is, this is peninsular Malaysia. You can see the different colors represent different species. I'll be going through the species in just a minute, so I won't go over them right now, but we can go to the next slide. This is Sumatra. Again, kind of hard to tell the island itself because it's out of the frame on both sides, but they're resident in Sumatra and some of the islands. Just south of Singapore, there's one as well. Slide. And Borneo. As you can see in these maps, they tend to like the coastal areas. It's because they're obligate peat swamp dwellers. There's one of the species that's sometimes found in clearer waters, but all of the rest of the species need to be in like dark peat-stained waters. And so they're associated with the lowland rainforest and the peat swamps. All of these fish, because of that, are highly endangered. There was a time not too long ago that the lowland peat swamps weren't in that big of a trouble when it came to logging and whatnot. Mostly because it's difficult to log in the swamps and you can't grow coffee there. But going back maybe 20, 25 years ago, people started to like vegetable oil more and more, and they're using it for biofuels and whatnot. And so these areas are excellent for growing palm oil. And so in the past 25, 30 years, we've been seeing huge amounts of these lowland peat swamp forests get destroyed. And so with them, you can see how endemic these species are to small areas. We see populations, species being wiped out overnight, basically. This is an example of some of the places that they're from. You can see, because of the dark peat-stained water, there's not a ton of aquatic vegetation. There's a pretty thick layer of leaf litter at the bottom, but most of the time, the licorice gouramis themselves can be found along the edges in some of the riparian vegetation that grows along the edges of these swamp waters. Slide. Another example, same kind of idea. Once again, I mean, when you're thinking about other fish that are from the peat swamp areas, some of the beta species, they tend to be on the forest floor itself, more in smaller puddle areas. Parosphromenus tend to stay in the streams that are in between and the larger water bodies, even though they tend to stay towards the edges. No, they're not as deep water fish. Slide. So that's more of the same. You can go to the next one. All right, so again, the water depth in these channels tends to vary. You can see these guys are in the middle of it and they're not up to their necks or anything. But the Parosphromenus can be found lower, but they tend to be collected towards the edges. These waters, obviously, if you're familiar with the water composition in peat swamp areas, very low carbonates, very low salinity, and also very low pH. So the pH in these waters are usually somewhere around 3.5, sometimes as high as 6 in some areas, but very much on the lower end of the spectrum. As I said before, the original habitats of Parosphromenus tend to be flowing streams that are within the peat swamps themselves. And that's where fresh spring waters and rain runs over the sandy soil. Typical of most tropical forest areas, it's very low nutrient areas, very low nutrient soil, and so the waters themselves are also very low in nutrients. Minimal salt, low pH. So I want to go over, just quickly, give you some pictures and descriptions of the 23 species of Parosphromenus. So this is, excuse me, Alfredi, Parosphromenus alfredi. Sure, when we get to them, I'll let you know for sure. So Alfredi is one from peninsular Malaysia. Again, peninsular Malaysia has probably so far had the highest destruction of the forest and the swamp areas. So all of the ones from peninsular Malaysia are specifically critically endangered, especially the ones with the smaller ranges. Alfredi is one of the ones that has a pretty small range. Today it only exists in remnants of its original swamp areas. It can still be found in some of the areas that are off of the palm oil plantations. I've got some pictures a little bit later on that will show when they convert land into these palm oil plantations, they channelize the rivers that are there, which make them much deeper and not as good for the fish. But they can still be found in some of those, in roadside ditches, that sort of a thing. So these are just more of the same species, Alfredi. Again, these are males. You can tell they've got the nice fins. I think there might be a couple of pictures of females as we go through, but you'll be able to see as they go through. And again, as we see other, so this is another example of their, sorry, you can go back to the habitat photo. This is an undisturbed habitat before a palm oil plantation has been put in. The water is shallow. All right, so the next species is Alani. This is a Bornean species, and similar to a lot of the ones from Sumatra and Borneo especially, because those areas, even though there is a lot of agriculture happening, there hasn't been a lot of research done on the areas, so they're not really exactly sure the full extent of the ranges for these fish. And some of them, like Alani, there are several places where they've sampled these fish, but there are phenotypic differences between those individual populations. And so again, with all these, even though I say there are 23 species, it's very difficult to define what a species is in the context of these fish. There's probably 3 major groupings of types of Parosphromenus, and the rest are all generally considered species based on either location or some phenotypic descriptors like their fins and whatnot. So Alani, for instance, it's known from 2 locations that are pretty widely separated, so it's possible that there are more populations. And the 2 populations that are known look slightly different, but as we go through the different pictures of them, you'll see some differences. So again, this one you can tell the body coloration is quite a bit different. The tail coloration in Alani has that broken red pattern, and that's pretty typical of that species. So that's a young male there, just starting to color up. Sometimes during breeding, it's more typical with the females where they'll lose the stripe pattern and they'll go into a tan body coloration. But this is also a male, but for some reason he's decided to go tan as well. All right, that's another Alani. All right, so the threat level for these guys in this area is pretty high, given the rapid destruction in that area. This is a Sarawak part of Borneo, and you can see in the one area that they found these fish specifically, there's been a construction of a highway that has destroyed that original type habitat, which used to be that and that. All right, and this is our next species, Ajagensis. This is another Bornean species, but it's from the southwest of Borneo. It's also one of the few Parosphromenus that has an overlapping range with another species, Ornacotata, but that's going to be later, because I'm doing these alphabetically, so Ornacotata will be a bit further down. But even though they occupy the same range, they occupy different niches within the localities. But yeah, interestingly, you can see like there's very, very little striping in the fins, where that's pretty typical of most of the others. One thing you can see in this male here is typical of a fish in breeding form. The stripe that's normally horizontal across the eye will go vertical. Hobbyists refer to this as sexy eyes, so he's got the sexy eyes. You can go to the next slide. And you can see the female's taking on sexy eyes in this one as well. So her body has gone mostly tan, where his is darkening up. And then, again, during their breeding displays, the male will, like with betas, will go around the female and flare the fins, inviting her into the breeding cave. That's another distinction of these fish, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, from other labyrinth fish, is they're cave breeders. And so it's a little bit unclear in the wild exactly what they're using for caves. It's pretty common in my experience that they'll use the underside of leaves that are in the tanks to do spawning sites. So it's probable that in the wild they're using large leaves or other natural seed pod kind of situations. Again, you can see there's quite a bit of variability even within individuals from the same species. And it's also possible that it's representing ones that were collected in different areas. So this is another example of the habitat of the Engigensis. All right, this is Parosphromenus barbarae. A little bit notable because it's one of the ones that's presumed to be extinct. Their original home range was pretty small to begin with, and that home range has been completely drained and turned into agriculture land. So they haven't been able to find it on any of the expeditions that have been looking for it in the past 10 or so years. The Parosphromenus project, which is something that I'm involved in, which is a hobbyist-run conservation organization, does have some individuals from this species, but at this point they're all female. So the outlook for this species is not good. But we do have a couple of pictures of when they were around. And you can see they look like a lot like Alani with that sort of broken red pattern in the caudal fin. And a female there. So this is what their habitat looked like before it was turned into an oil palm plantation. Again, pretty typical, shallow, with the riparian vegetation at the edges. And this is a little bit less typical for a habitat for them, but like I said before, like bettas, they can often be found on the forest floor in seasonal pools, especially during the flood season. And this is, again, Michael Lowe. He's one of the guys who's gone in and tried to survey for this species. I believe this is during an expedition where he failed to find the species and its remnant habitat that's still there. All right. This is Parosphromenus bintan. Parosphromenus bintan is an interesting one. It's from an island off of Sumatra, Bintan Island. That's where the type species was collected. The difficulty is that now that they've done more exploring for these fish in different parts of Sumatra and even Malaysia, they're finding fish that look almost identical to this. I have some fish here on the table from that sort of fish that look like this fish. The fish that I have on the table were collected in Sumatra in the Rayu area, which is near Jambai. It's sort of central. And they have a very similar fin coloration to this, but they're clearly not the same species that are from the island. Again, depending on how you define species. So yeah, this species does have a wider range than the others based on the fact that they're similar looking types in different localities. So we can go through and see a couple of different versions of it. Again, from locality to locality, there can be quite a bit of difference as far as the blues and the reds in the fins. Bintan usually is mostly a blue with very little red in the fins themselves. So there's a group, when they're not displaying, that's the thing is, when you go online or the pictures I'm showing tonight, it's usually males in full breeding finnage, and so they look really super pretty. I think they're really attractive fish even when they're not displaying, but this is normally what you're gonna see, and what you'll probably see in the cup tonight too, is fish that are just not looking amazingly flashy. And this is an example of their biotope. Again, you can see in the water a pretty deep leaf litter layer. That seems to make them more comfortable, plenty of hiding places and breeding areas. Another one, same. All right, this is Decenerae. This is a species that's from an island. Again, similar to Bintan, they're from Bintan Island. An interesting thing about this is up until maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, this was the only species known, or at least described. So one of the problems that we have here in this country, especially when licorice gouramis are imported, is that they're almost always called Parosphromenus decenerae because that was the type species for the whole genus. And almost none of the species that are imported to this country are actually decenerae. But it's obviously a beautiful fish. It's one of the larger of the Parosphromenus. And again, as I mentioned, there's probably about 3 major types. Am I getting out of the camera? Sorry about that. I'm creeping up on people. This is one of the spike tail types of Parosphromenus. So the males on their caudal fin will have a pronounced several rays at the tip. You can kind of see that a little bit there. Also, again, unusual for Parosphromenus to have a red body coloration. And it's shared by 1 or 2 other species. One of the things that they tend to, sorry, taxonomists tend to look at when they're looking at the different Parosphromenus species is the position they take when they're displaying. So this is one of the head down displayers, which is the vast majority of them. There are 3 or 4 species that will take a head up display, but they're showing good examples of head down display. And again, the creative use of different pods and hides for breeding. So this is, you can't see the female here, but the female has just deposited some eggs into his anal fin, and so he's kind of cupping them. He'll probably end up dropping them and then pulling them back up into the bubble nest. And this is an example of their habitat. So the islands of Bintan and Bangka, they're relatively undisturbed for the moment, but they're relatively small islands. And there has been mining and oil palm plantations. You can see an oil palm plantation on the right side coming in. And it can definitely cause problems with the riparian vegetation and also reduction of range. And they're also, even though they're small fish and relatively slow fish, they do tend to live in moving water. And so when the water starts to stagnate like this, it can cause problems for them. And this is an example of a before and after. So the bottom one, there's still a lot of habitat, but obviously trees have been starting to be cleared, which can cause degradation. All right, this is filamentosis, another one of the spike-tailed gouramis. These are from Borneo and from the sort of the southwest of Borneo. These are, again, one of the larger Parosphromenus. And we can slide here. There's some variation in color. This has a pretty wide range as far as like, they're known for more than one location. And so each of the locations has some subtle differences in fin patterning and fin coloration as well. This one's a highly red one, and this one's a highly yellow-blue one. One interesting note about these guys is the males tend to be more aggressive than the others from this genus, and so it's not recommended to keep more than one male in a tank. There's usually not a high amount of violence. This is a female of that species. You can see, again, the finnage is pretty similar, so you can tell them apart from others from that, but the coloration is pretty subdued. All right, and this one is a Gunnawani. It's sort of a mouthful. This is part of that Bintan lake complex. These were described as their own species. They're only been collected from one location, and that's sort of central Sumatra. But there is sort of red, you can see in all of the unpaired fins, a red band, which is different from most of the other Bintan-like fish. It's harder to see in darker water, obviously, that there's some red, which leads to a lot of, there's pointing out that there's red in the fins. And a comparison between Parosphromenus CF Bintan, which is ones that I've got over here, and Gunnawani, which again has a little bit different coloration in the fins. In a recent expedition, they've gone back to the original location, which is still relatively untouched. It's surrounded by a lot of agricultural land, so the fear is that one place that they're known from is going to be converted soon, but for the time being, there's still a population. You can also see that the top right corner is Gunnawani, and it's got a pretty short body compared to some of the other Bintan-like ones. All right, so that one is Harveyii. Harveyii is one of the peninsular Malaysia fish. You can tell that they're very similar to the Bintan-like fish. Again, let's try another slide. I think there's some more red in the fins in these guys. But this is another one of the species where, because again, peninsular Malaysia has been mostly converted to agricultural land, they're still surviving in marginal parts of their original range. This is a terrible picture, I apologize. But there's been a lot of logging and destruction of the swamps they're native to. So again, even though this area is more highly populated, so there are more people out looking for the fish, they're still finding some in some of the more degraded zones, but the wild population is not doing well. In 2018, there was an expedition that went out and was still able to find a decent number in some of the marginal locations. This is Parosphromenus julianae, another one of the island sort of sub-island fish. So this one's native to Bintan and Bangka. And in Finnish, they're a lot like, where am I at? I'm at Juliana. Okay, they're a lot like Decenari. And they have the red body coloration similar to, oh, and he's got the sexy eyes there too. I just recently imported a few of these fish, so I've got these, and they're breeding well. I wasn't able to bring any tonight, but we should have some soon. Again, because it's an island and there's active agriculture on the island, the conservation need's pretty strong with these fish. And that's there. All right, Kishi. So Kishi's interesting. It's one of the two, along with Julia and I, most recently described in this genus. These are known from only one area that's actually in an active oil palm plantation. It's possible that there are more populations above, upstream, and downstream, but for right now, scientifically, all we know is that they're from that one location. And I know for a fact that there were a number that were imported privately, and those have all died at this point. They've died out, so there are none captively held that we know of. That's their habitat, that one stream there. You can see that because of the channelization, the water is a lot more turbid than some of the other waters that we've seen. They don't like really turbid water. They like clear, tea-stained water, and this is getting towards turbid, not tea-stained water. So, all right, this is one of my favorites. I've got a couple of representatives here. This is Linkyeye, another spike-tailed gourami, but obviously very different in the finnage. They've got that spotted coloration. And the two black spots sort of in the center of the fish will take on like a green metallic sheen depending on the lighting. You can see a little bit there. These are really hardy fish. They seem to be really good for beginners, if there is a beginner for these kind of fish. But yeah, I've done really well with them. They've bred really well. They seem really tolerant of a bit wider range of pH than some of the other Parosphromenus. They get along well with each other, and they breed really well. One of the ladies who's involved, one of the heads of the Parosphromenus project, has said that if you've got teenage Linkyeye in a tank, you're going to have babies. That's just how that works. So, yeah, they have some of the larger bubble nests and can have, I think this species can have up to 100 eggs in a nest. Even though their range is relatively wide, they're known from a couple of pretty widely separated areas. Most of the areas that they're from are heavy with human contact. This one is a pond that's obviously it's got a bridge across it. But the population there seems to be doing well for now. But again, the question is how long will they be able to survive in heavily human modified territories? Okay. This is Nagyeye. These are peninsular Malaysia as well. They're from the eastern side of the peninsula, and their range is relatively long up the peninsula. And each of the several spots where they've been collected has a slightly different fin pattern, especially the caudal fin. This one doesn't have a white edge to the caudal fin, but several of the populations are different based on the edges of their caudal fin. Obviously, their body coloration is really different from some of the others. Most of the other species, the male's bodies stays that stripe pattern. They might get darker, but this goes from having a normal stripe pattern to that really strong cherry red on the top and black on the bottom. And I've seen them in life as well. The iridescence on the unpaired fins is really bright and really incredible. That's a female. Very pretty still, even though she doesn't have all the iridescence of the others. And a picture of a nesting. And that's a good example of how the iridescence looks when the light catches them just right. Okay, another pair. And a male looking pretty. Okay, so this is Ornicatata. So this is, again, a representative of maybe the third type that I see within Parosphromenus. This is the very thin-bodied type, a low-headed type, and also a head-up spawning type. They also have that cool two-tone coloration when they get into their breeding display. These are from Borneo, lowland Borneo. And they are currently found in areas that tend to be less developed right now than other parts of Borneo. So they're not as threatened as some of the other species. And they're also really popular with fish keepers. So they're more often seen in this country than maybe some of the others. Okay, so this is a Pahuensis. Pahuensis is from Borneo, but from the northeastern part of Borneo, which is a place where there aren't any other described species from. So there's not much known about them because it's from a relatively remote area of Borneo. There's not a ton of good pictures of them, and there aren't very many in captivity. So this is they're all from the same. This is all from the same tank. The pictures that I have of them, but they're obviously somewhat similar phenotypically to the Lynchii with the spotted unpaired fins. And from what I've been told, they're really good breeders. And if possible, we should try to get some more of those in the hobby. All right, so this is a Palidica, and they're from Peninsular Malaysia. These are the northernmost of the licorice gouramis. So these are the ones that can go up into the southern tip of Thailand. Again, another wide-ranging fish, and so again, because of the ongoing speciation within this whole genus, in the different locations that they're found, there's a variety of fin patterning coloration. This is one of the fish that is the one of the genus that isn't completely tied to low pH acid waters. They're found in some higher pH and clear waters, even though they still prefer peat swamps. You can see there's still a lot of iridescence, even though it's generally less specific in bands the way that the other Parosphromenus are. And that's a female. Just trying to see if I have notes for anything more on them. Oh. Yeah, they're. You can see that these waters are not quite as darkly tea stained as the others, so their biotopes are less tied to the swamps. Again, with all of these species, their habitats have been impacted by human activity as well. Just because of their wide range, it seems to be less immediate than some of the other species. Okay, this is Parvulus. It's another one of the thinner-bodied Parosphromenus, also a head-up display Parosphromenus. And these are probably the most dependent on really low acidity blackwater habitats. So they're found in like 3 pH in a lot of their home range. And they're another, probably has the widest home range of any of the species. And each of the locations, again, has differences in fin patterning across the populations. So there's a couple different representatives here of different fin pattern. You can see the red spots, larger or smaller. The white fin margins are larger or smaller depending on the different areas that they come from. I've not worked with them, so I don't know how difficult they are to keep, but they're also popular in the hobby. And because of their wide range, the ability to collect them is a bit more than some of the others as well. All right, this is Phenocurus. I have some of these at home as well. I didn't get a chance to bring any tonight. These are another one where there's only one type locality that they've been sampled from. It's a very small swamp off of Rayu in Sumatra. And for the time being, the swamp is holding steady. There isn't any oil palm plantation planned for it, but again, the whole area is being used for agriculture. So the chances that they're going to do well in the long run is pretty low. Obviously a very pretty species. They're very similar to Alfredi in Peninsular Malaysia, which again threw people for a loop when they first discovered them because it's very unclear how the species are distributed and how the similar looking types have ended up in such widely diverse places. But because they're known from only one location, they're pretty easy to identify against other Parosphromenus. You can see the caudal fin has, instead of that round shape that most of the others have, the color in the caudal fin is more of a rhomboid type shape, which is a defining characteristic of these fish. And they're obviously a head down spawner. This one's head up. I don't know why you decided to be different. You can see here 2 males squaring off against each other. Like a lot of the other, like the betas, they can be aggressive towards each other, not nearly as aggressive as some of the betas. They'll almost never cause damage, but they will nip at each other in their displays. So again, they can be kept in groups, but usually better once you've got a pair formed, to pull the pair away from any others. And that's two males again, kind of going for their dance. This is Parosphromenus quindecem. They're from a south central Borneo. Again, one of the larger Parosphromenus species. They've got really interesting fin coloration, a combination of blues, reds, yellows. Let me see my notes on these guys. So the overall distribution of this fish in Borneo is not clear. There's several sites that they're known from. Some of the sites are a little bit more remote, so they seem to be a more stable population, but some of the known sites have already been destroyed. And so it's a male and a female there. A male and a female not in breeding action, so they've got sort of a duller coloration. That's an interesting thing about these fish, which I'm not sure is similar to a lot of the other betta species, but they can be highly different in color. So the males in breeding can get very bright and very defined, but then the ones you'll see here tonight are going to be really tan with almost no coloration to their fin because they're a little bit stressed out. So depending on their mood, their colors can change quite a bit. Some young ones over here on the right. All right. This is a Rubermontis. So this is a peninsular Malaysian species from the west side of the peninsula. And they're from a place that, like their scientific name, was called Red Mountain. And at one time it was incredibly diverse, a beautiful forest area. It has been completely destroyed. And so there's very, very, very little remnant of peat swamp forest in their home range. And so that there's not many of them in captivity, and very few that look likely to be able to be gotten, but a very pretty fish. And that's a picture of their former habitat. And submit more. This is Sumatranus. Like their name suggests, they're from the island of Sumatra, and they are known from several different sites on the island. Interestingly, quite a bit different from the other species, and then that's not clear whether or not they are one species, because they tend to appear in two body forms. This was one of the thin-bodied form, a lot like Parvulus or Ornacatata, but there's also a higher-bodied form, which is in body shape a lot like the others. So it's, again, unclear whether or not this is like an ongoing split of the species, or whether it represents two different species, or whether it's just different shaped ones of the same species. There haven't been very many taxonomists working specifically on these fish. The Parosphromenus project, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end, has one scientist who's starting to work on the genetics of these fish and better understand the interactions between them. All right, this is Tweedii. So Tweedii is a Western Malaysian, peninsular Malaysian species. Also very similar to the Phoenicurius in that they have the almost all red unpaired fins, but you can see that the caudal fin is round. So I think they're really pretty. They have a very high threat to their continued existence in the wild. None of the original habitats they were from or originally found have been completely untouched. So they're still holding on in a few areas, but they're all heavily modified areas where they're still found. Yeah, so that's a picture of what's left of some of their habitats. And you can see ongoing eutrophication happening, and the plants are coming in, so they're getting smaller. All right, so more of the meat of what I wanted to talk about is how to take care of these fish, right? So we can go for the slide. The most important thing is, as I mentioned before, the low pH, low carbonate water. They're from peat swamps, and so if you're going to keeping them in water with very low dissolved compounds and low conductivity, low pH is pretty important. I use rainwater, collected rainwater, for the fish that I keep at home. Some people recommend against that because of the variability of rainwater, but I've found it to be pretty consistent. Obviously, you can use RODI water as well, modified. Temperature is important for these fish. I'm a little bit concerned about my guys because it's a little bit chilly here. They like between 25 Jackie's going to check on them. Oh, thank you. Let me just go back to where I was. Yeah, so between 25 and 30 temperature is good for them. Sometimes during some of especially in the northern areas, during the winter it can get as low as 22 and as high up to like 26, but it's pretty consistent in that area of the world. So keeping them at that consistency is good. All right. So yeah, again, Chester Zoo in England has put together a care guide for keeping these fish, and they recommend using a bare bottom tank for breeding fish. But for the fish that I keep at home, I like to have leaf litter substrate. I've seen them put on like the peat pellet substrate. I've also used sphagnum moss as a substrate for them. But I find that they like to dive into the substrate when I'm around. So giving them places to hide amongst the leaves is helpful for them. For breeding and for hiding in general, tubes have been a good idea. They're cave breeders, so anything that's cave-like they'll use. I didn't have any pictures of pods, but people have used natural pods for the fish as well. In the bottom left corner, I like to use the Weekend terracotta waterers. That work pretty well. They're cheap, that's why I like them. As far as tank setup is concerned, again, if you look at all the pictures of habitat that I showed, there's very little plants in the water. So most of the time they don't need plants to be happy. You can have plants along the edges, but a relatively unadorned tank is usually what people keep them in. Again, I like to use leaf litter. This is an example of having plants that would be representative of the riparian vegetation that would be along the edges. And this is a Chester Zoo breeding tank setup. So they went for the bare bottom with just a couple of leaves, very minimal plants, but then several spawning sites. I just threw that in there. As far as tank size goes, some people I know, I was just talking to them, keeping them in very small tanks. 2.5 gallons is probably enough for the size of the fish. There's some of the species that get a little bit large where 2.5 would be a bit of a squeeze, but I keep my fish in 5-gallon tanks and 10-gallon tanks. Feeding is pretty easy, except for the fact that they will not eat anything that's not live. I say that with a little bit of an asterisk. I've had fish before that I've gotten to eat on dry food, but that was only because they were in a tank with other fish that kind of taught them how to eat the dry food. But if you're maintaining them in a larger population, live food's the way to go. I use grindle worms, I use mosquito larvae. I've not tried brine shrimp very much, but I know a lot of people use brine shrimp to feed them. And also microworms are an option for food. All right. You can keep them in groups. They're very peaceful in groups. The males may display at each other, but there's not much in the way of aggression. Females do really well in groups. For breeding, it's not recommended to keep them in groups because the non-parental fish can pick off fry. So it's better not necessarily to have them in groups for that. Some people like to keep their fish in mixed species displays. They're really peaceful in mixed species displays, sometimes too peaceful. If their tank mates are too boisterous, they can be outcompeted for food. So for my fish, since my focus is breeding, I don't have them in mixed species, but things that would be naturally in their biotope, rasboras, bararas. The one up in the left corner has a characin in it from South America, and that's, again, as long as the size and the activity level is, I know, right? As long as the size and activity level is okay, they won't cause much trouble, but breeding won't be as often in a tank that's mixed species. So we're going to talk a little bit about breeding. Again, I mentioned that they'll display, the male will display to the female, and then sort of lead her to the nuptial cave. They'll do their little dance, and they'll have an embrace. And then the female will lay several eggs into the anal fin of the male where he fertilizes, and then do a little dance there. And depending on the species, some species, the male and the female will place eggs into the bubble nest, which you can see right at the top of the cave there. Most of the time it's just the male, but the females have been observed putting eggs into the bubble nest. This is another difference. This is Negii breeding, but you can see that they've got a pretty large bubble nest as well. And they do a lot. This is a sequence showing a lot of the embrace and the rolling that they'll do. But then you can see that as the eggs fall to the bottom, one or both will bring them up to the top. and you can see the eggs are attached to the surface of the top of the cave. This is one of the reasons why the low pH is important, because in the presence of any carbonates, the sort of gel layer on the egg will not be very sticky and the eggs will fall. And keeping them up at the top is important. So Parosphromenus are pretty slow growing fish, but this is an example of what they look like as they're growing. This is a filamentosus growing, by the way. But that's one fish as it grows. A couple of things. The development of the eggs can vary with temperature. The larvae usually hatch in under 24 hours post-fertilization, but definitely within 48 hours. There's a couple of different thoughts about whether to keep the parents with the babies as they're hatching and growing. I keep my parents with the eggs as they're hatching and growing, and I haven't seen much in the way of predation or problems with that. But there are breeders that will either remove the whole cave and bring it to a new water. The problem there is that the fry are very sensitive to changes in water quality, so sometimes it's better to move the adults rather than the babies. One of the problems that we have in this country, again, as I said, when it comes to breeding, especially conservation breeding for these fish, is that almost everything is called Parosphromenus decineri. You can see that's not a Parosphromenus decineri. That's a Harveyi, even though this place is calling them Parosphromenus decineri. So that's one of the challenges when I got into this hobby specifically, is finding correct collection location, which tends to be more important than what they're calling them as species. Because if you can find out where they're collected, you probably have a good sense of what species they are. You can see that because they're heavily speciated, and that might be more of a function of the taxonomists rather than the animals themselves, knowing the collection location is super important for importing fish and then breeding them for conservation purposes. Okay. So I got involved with these fish, it was probably 16, 20 years ago. I was living in Oregon. I visited a really terrible pet shop called Circus World, and there was these cool little striped fish in the tank, and I asked the guy, what are these? He said, oh, these are licorice gouramis. My son was ordering the fish. He thought that they were chocolate gouramis, so he got that wrong. I was like, all right, I'll take all of them. I didn't know what I was doing. I had them in the worst situation possible. They were like with other fish. It was higher pH water. Some of them survived, but they didn't breed, but I was hooked. And so I moved from Oregon out to the Northeast to work at the New England Aquarium with Jackie. And then I started working at Harvard. So I didn't keep licorice gouramis for a long time. But in 2020, like many people, I was bored and I wanted to get back into the hobby. So I got back into licorice gouramis, and I contacted the Parosphromenus Project, which is a European organization that's focused specifically on this genus. And I was asking them some questions, and the leader of the project, Helene Schuby, asked me if I wanted to be the US representative for the Parosphromenus Project, and I said yes, so that's what I'm doing here. The Parosphromenus Project's goals are to deepen understanding of Parosphromenus, to share the knowledge, raise awareness about the endangered species, to advocate for their preservation, but also to figure out ways that they can be active in the preservation of the species. So the underlying thought process for how this is going to happen was to have individual hobbyists keeping and breeding the species and trying to form a network of those hobbyists. Yeah, so that's the Parosphromenus Project. An important aspect of the Parosphromenus Project is the twice yearly census, where the people who are keeping Parosphromenus give an account for how many fish and what species that they're keeping. And this allows the project to keep an eye on the population, and if there are any dips in population of any one species or another, they can contact the various hobbyists and try to move fish in between. You can't see it on here, but there aren't very many US hobbyists represented in the census. So that's one of the things I'm responsible to try to do, is to increase awareness and increase involvement in the census. So because I've worked in science for the past 14 years, I was aware of for several different species, there are genetic stock centers. So Xiphophorus has one. The next slide, we've got Ambystoma has one. And so I thought, hey, that might be an interesting thing to do, is to sort of create a genetic stock center for Parosphromenus. So that's what I did. And so in my basement now, I have multiple racks of Parosphromenus, and I'm breeding them. this is my current breeding rack setup. I'm sorry, it looks terrible, but it works. And so since the 2020, I've gotten up to 6 species that I'm working with, and 2 undescribed locations. I'm building a new rack that's going to be all 5-gallon tanks for breeding. Next slide is, I guess it's back to that one. In the drilling process? 3. Yeah, I didn't crack any of the 20 gallons. These I got, I described it on my website as an anonymous donation. My work was getting rid of these, so I got these from work, and I cracked a few of them while I was drilling them. So yeah, in addition to having the fish, I've created a website, and it has a bunch of resources that are available. You got the website name here. If anybody needs it or wants it, I'm sure they can contact Jackie, who knows me, and she can get you that information. But again, one of the problems that I've had as a Parosphromenus keeper in this country is finding the fish. They're available sometimes from specialty online retailers, but it's difficult to find them. It's difficult to get them. So I also created a Parosphromenus Finder website app. It's a website too, but where people who are keeping and breeding these fish can list their excess fish and have them available for sale. I've got 3 species on this, and right now I'm the only person that has any fish on there, but hopefully this is going to get bigger and be a useful resource for people who want to keep these fish. So moving forward, obviously, having a hobbyist conservation system is difficult because all that we can do as hobbyists in this country right now is keep that insurance population of fish in our homes and record them, make sure that that's happening. But there is ongoing efforts as far as surveying the places that we know that they are still living in the wild and seeing what the trends are. And the Parosphromenus project is working with several conservation organizations in Malaysia and Indonesia. There's Orangutan International. I've got the actual name for it, but there's a conservation organization working with orangutans. They have this national park area that also includes some Parosphromenus habitat. So one of the ideas is that if we can work with people who are already on the ground, who already have land, that can be helpful. One of the researchers who has been doing work on Parosphromenus, Kishi, he has a Parosphromenus named after him. He was able to purchase land in Indonesia. It's a very, I think a 6-acre plot of land. And he planted some trees and he's been conserving that area. He's working with betas, but he's found that the species density in the conserved area is as high or higher than natural areas. So the model for buying land, conserving land, restoring land is really good for these fish. So we're, as the Parosphromenus project is ongoing, trying to form closer connections with conservation organizations that can take care of land. Let me get to that slide there. Yeah, so also these are some of the organizations that we're partnered with. Various, whether it be zoos, museums, Shoal and ASAP are both international conservation organizations that are specifically working on freshwater fish, and in ASAP's case, specifically animals from Southeast Asia. And yeah, that's more ASAP information. So let's go to the next slide, actually. Do I have another slide, or is that the last one? Perfect. All right. There are not any zoos or aquariums in this country I know that are working specifically with Parosphromenus. There are several zoos and aquariums in Europe that are working with Parosphromenus. But my hope is that as conservation hobbyists, we can increase the stock that are in captivity and increase awareness, and hopefully get some zoos and aquariums involved as well. But that's what I've got. That's what I had to talk about tonight. Does anybody have any questions that I might be able to answer about these fish? Sir.
Yeah, so at such a low pH, do you worry about like the nitrogen cycle or ammonia buildup?
Nitrogen cycle is tough. I mean, yeah, obviously the nitrifying bacteria is not really doing a great job with those low pHs. Water changes tend to be the best option. I find that plants do pretty well keeping the nitrates low. They are pretty sensitive to organics, so it's good to keep them as low as possible. That's why with my systems, I don't have them in individual tanks. It's part of a recirculating system, so I can keep the water volume high, and I can also do large water changes pretty easily with those systems. Yes, so that's, if it was just one person doing it, then probably within 3 or 4 generations, you start seeing a reduction in fecundity. But that's one of the advantages to having the network, is that once your fish are starting to show some of those signs, if you get new stock in, they tend to bounce back pretty well. So the Parosphromenus project is probably on F10 generations or more of captive bred that are still going pretty strong. So.
Differences in between species, some that can handle more breeding than others. I feel like I see that all the time.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the problem is there are some species that are just more difficult to breed. So like Kishi, for instance, there were probably 60, 70 fish that were imported, and none of those bred and survived. So it's difficult to know whether they would do well in the long term. Some of the hardier species like Filamentosis and Linckii seem to do pretty well in the long term. So I think one of the things that's frustrating about Parosphromenus is so little is known to know what's going to happen in the long term with breeding programs, but I guess we do the best we can.
Does the pH requirement after successive generations, does it ever ease up a little bit?
That's species dependent, yeah. So I know, like with Linckii, for instance, they can be bred in close to 7, so 6.5 or so. And I would assume with successive generations, you could probably bend that a little bit. But I mean, at some level, especially with some of the more specific species, they're just so well adapted for it that to try to push them out of that range doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So if having really low pH water is difficult for a hobbyist, it's probably better to go with one of the types that can take a higher pH. So like I know Peladuca can, and Linckii can, and Filamentosis I think can do a higher pH as well. Excellent. Well, as I said, if anyone has any other questions or want to know more, Jackie can give you my information, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody who wants to. Thank you.